Hey, my name is Eoin, I'm an artist at Quixel, and today I'm going to be covering creating a realistic environment using Megascans in Unreal Engine 4. I'll be covering a bunch of stuff, including setting up materials, going over lighting, post-process settings, and how I set up my scatter systems. If you aren't already familiar with the Megascans service, it's essentially a huge collection of scanned surfaces, atlases, and 3D meshes. And everything's consistently calibrated so you can swap different meshes and assets out and know that the values are going to stay consistent. It's a super useful resource for any kind of artist, and it's constantly evolving with many new assets being added. Alright, to start off, I've created this basic empty scene in UE4. The next step will be downloading and importing Megascans assets and then creating master materials for them. If you're already comfortable creating your own master materials and importing the assets, feel free to skip ahead to the fun part where we deal with lighting, post-processing, and laying out the assets in a scene. So I'm going to go head over to the Megascans site, and I've already picked out a rock in the library that I think is pretty cool. So when we select an asset to download on the Megascans site, you're going to have a load of options here. If you're new, it might be a bit overwhelming. All you have to worry about for Unreal Engine is that you have the real-time context selected. You can select LODs if you want. There are levels of detail, so the meshes in the distance can be defined to be lower res to save performance. And then you want your albedo, cavity, normal, and roughness maps also checked. Just go ahead and download that. And I also am going to download a plant asset because I want to cover creating both opaque materials such as rocks and also masked foliage assets such as this dandelion. So this doesn't have as many options. Just go ahead and select JPEG format and download that as well. So when the assets are downloaded, you can then import them to the Unreal Editor. When you extract the zip file, you should see something like this. If you selected all LODs, you'll see several LOD normals. This is fine. All we're going to worry about now is LOD 1 and LOD 5, and I'll show you how to blend between them depending on the distance that you're at. So we're going to select the albedo file, the cavity file, the LOD 1 and the LOD 5 normals, and then the roughness file, and also the corresponding FBX files, which are the actual mesh files. So we're going to go ahead and let them import. When it gets to an FBX import dialog, it should pop up with something, and you can go ahead and import with the default settings. Alright, so there's a few things you have to set up with the textures to make sure they're displayed correctly in Unreal Engine. Any color textures like this albedo map can be left fine. It's a compression setting of default, which is perfectly fine. However, for any grayscale maps like the cavity or the roughness map, we want to make sure the compression settings are set to masks. Next, we want to make sure that our normal maps are displayed correctly too. We want to just make sure that the green channel is flipped here and that the compression settings are normal map, which should be on by default. So we'll do this for both of our LOD normals. And now the maps are all ready to use. So we have our two mesh assets here, and right now there's no material assigned. So we're going to create a master material. I've made a new folder called Master Materials, and I'm going to add new Materials and Textures Material. And I'm going to name it Opaque Master Material. So when we jump in here, you're greeted by the empty material graph, and if you're new, you probably have no idea what's going on, but it's actually fairly simple when you get used to it, and really powerful and allows you to build a lot of cool things. So for this basic setup, we basically need to connect our albedo texture to our base color, our roughness texture to our roughness slot, normal to normal slot, and then we also have our cavity map, which we multiplied over our base color. So to quickly go over the map types and what they are, if you're new to this, you're probably wondering what all the colors are. Essentially, the albedo map is the color of the texture without any shadow detail. So there's no lighting information saved in this color map, which means you can light it at any angle and it'll update realistically. The second map is the cavity map. This is small scale shadows in the mesh. It's pretty useful if you're trying to add some micro detail and micro shadowing that isn't captured by the render engine by default. Then we have our normal map, which saves lighting information baked from the high poly mesh. So this really helps you boost the detail of a low res mesh and help get the small fine details that wouldn't be captured by a low poly model. And finally, we have a roughness map. This is basically a microsurface map, which defines how rough or smooth the surface is, or how wet or dry it looks. in the editor. So with that said, we're going to go ahead and create a new texture sample parameter. And this is the node that accepts textures and allows you to bring them out into the material editor. Just a quick note, I'm actually making a shader that's a bit more complex to allow for more artistic control over the assets. But if you just want to plug and play, you can simply copy this shader setup I have here and the assets will work just fine. So by default, we're going to grab our albedo map from that asset, and we're going to multiply the albedo strength by a scalar parameter. And all that is a number, so you want to multiply it by whatever amount. We're going to call this brightness, and we're going to leave it at 1 for now, which won't do anything. It'll just be the same intensity. But later on, if we wanted to change the brightness of an asset, it's really easy to just change this value. And since we're doing a master material and all Megascans assets have the same input textures, all we have to do then is create a material instance and swap out the material textures for each new asset that we bring in. And then we can play with all the values that we're going to set up, and they'll stay unique for each asset that you have in the engine, which is pretty cool. So I'm just going to rename this node as well. So we would normally just input this albedo map to the base color, but we're also going to use a cavity map here. So what we want to do is we want to copy and paste this texture parameter node. We're going to name it cavity. And we're going to select the cavity map here. So we're going to run this through a power node, which will allow you to control the contrast of the shadows here, which is useful. So another scalar parameter hooked into the exponent there, and we're going to name it cavity. All right, so then how do we get these two inputs to go to one input? We're just going to multiply the albedo by the cavity. So now we have the albedo color with the shadows of the cavity map overlaid. It's kind of hard to see in this material ball here, but we can see it very clearly on the mesh in a minute. If texture memory or shader instructions are becoming an issue for your project, you can of course skip the cavity altogether and hook the albedo directly into the base color instead. So it's also a good idea to comment what you're doing. If you select a bunch of nodes and hit C and name, it's very easy to organize your material graphs, especially if other people are using it, or even for yourself later on. It pays to be a bit organized right now in the early stages. So we're going to make a cavity and albedo comment there. So the next map we're going to look at is the specular input, and we don't actually need specular maps. However, by default, the Unreal Engine has a value of 0.5 here, and basically for a lot of Megascans assets, this can look like a white sheen over the mesh, which can actually take away from the realism. So I found if you multiply the red channel of the albedo by an amount and set that into the specular input, it actually gives a cool result, and I think it looks a lot more natural, and it gives you more control over how the specular looks rather than having a constant white kind of sheen over the mesh, which doesn't look very good in most cases. So I'm going to rename this to specular, and we'll keep it at 1 for now. I'm just going to comment it. Just to quickly comment on this specular trick, I did this purely as an artistic choice, as I feel it gives a bit more control over how the light hits the mesh. However, it's perfectly fine to leave the specular input blank and at the default value. Okay, so the next map we have to look at is the roughness map. So I'm actually going to copy the albedo logic here, and I'm going to rename. So we're going to swap out this albedo map for the roughness map, which is right here. And you can see the sampler type actually changed to masked, which is what we want. We also want to change this parameter to roughness amount. And we'll keep it at 1 for now, which is not changing anything, but we have the control to change it later on if we want to. So this would change how wet or dry the asset looks. So we'll hook this up into the roughness input, and we're good to go. If you want to use a reroute node, you can double click on a wire and move it around. It just makes it a bit tidier if you're worried about the wires getting all tangled. So next up, we've got the normal map. So this is pretty easy as well. We're going to copy paste this texture node, name it normal, and we'll select the correct normal. And you can see the sampler type is set to normal. So a common thing you want to do with normal maps is increase or decrease the strength of the normal map, which can help take back or accentuate details on a mesh. So it's really, really useful. And I honestly use a material function for this normally. Just material function is basically a snippet of material graph code, which can be then in one node, which can save space on your material and make it really reusable all over the place. But for the sake of this tutorial, I'm going to keep it simple and just power through it now, but feel free to copy me. Essentially what we're doing is we're multiplying the red channel and the green channel by a scalar parameter and then appending in the blue channel. So we're not doing anything to the blue channel, but we're multiplying the strength of the red and green by an amount. So if you don't understand this, that's totally fine. Just you can follow along if you want to have the normal strength function that I have here. So we're going to copy a parameter, name it normal amount or normal strength, and by default I'm going to keep it at 1, but we can change this later on depending on the asset. So we've got the red channel multiplied, the green channel multiplied, and then we want to append the blue channel to the red and green channels appended together. Okay, so this is a normal strength, and that goes into the normal input here. Like the specular trick that I showed before, the normal strength trick is also something that's an artistic choice and it's optional, but I would recommend it, especially for foliage, if you want to push out some of the details and make the effect of the normal map even stronger, or even take it back in cases where you want a subtle amount of detail but nothing too strong. Alright, so now everything's set up. So if we were to go back to the editor, I'm going to save out this material, and we can go back out here to the editor. I'm going to find our master material folder, and we're going to right click and create a material instance, and we're going to call this rock 01 mat. So then I can move this to our rock folder, and we have everything nicely here in one folder. So we've got the input textures, the input meshes, and the material instance for that mesh. This is my usual workflow. Keeps it nice and tidy and easy to find everything that you need. So by default, you're going to be greeted by all of these grayed out parameters in this material. We can override them here with the checkboxes. So if you were to create a new rock asset, if you were to import a new rock asset, you would just duplicate this material instance or create a new one from the master material, and then override the textures here. So the input textures would be overridden, and you can still play with the values. So each tweak here is only relevant to this instance. So if you make a new instance of the material, it'll have its own brightness value. If you go into the master material and you make a change, that has to be actually compiled, and you have to wait for it to save every time before you see a change. But if you use parameters and material instances, you can tweak on the fly in the editor. So I'll just show that off real quick. I'm going to drag out the LOD1 mesh here. We're going to apply the material to it, and you can see it's worked nicely. So now we can actually tweak these parameters on the fly, like I said. So we've got the main brightness of the asset. We've got the cavity power, which is the high frequency shadows of the mesh, useful to tweak as well. We've got the normal strength, which is how much the normal map is multiplied by. We've got the roughness amount, which is how wet or dry the mesh appears. It's hard to see in that angle, but it's doing something. And we have our specular amount, which is the kind of white sheen I mentioned before. So by default, you're actually going to get something like this. If you just have the default value of 0.5 in the original shader setup, you're going to have this kind of weird white overlay over the mesh. So I recommend doing what I did here, taking it doesn't need to be the red channel of the albedo, but basically any mask and multiplying it by an amount and going into the specular. It'll just help break it up and make it look a bit more natural. So I recommend doing that in general. So honestly, most of the maps look great on default values, but to have the control to play with them is very useful later on, especially if you're going for a specific color scheme or brightness level. Okay, so next up we're going to handle the foliage example. I've made a new folder here, and I'm going to import the foliage files. You can see the structure is a bit different to the rock asset we had, but essentially it's the same. We're having variations. Each variation has its own LOD step, and we'll use the same input textures. So LODs 0 to 2 are going to use the Atlas texture folder, and then LODs 3 are actually billboards, so they'll use the billboards textures here. So you don't have to worry too much about this, but if you did want to go into heavy LODing, especially in large scenes, you want to definitely be using the billboards to save performance. So we're going to go ahead and import the albedo, the normal, the opacity, the roughness, and the translucency. So you can see we have opacity and translucency here, and no cavity maps. That's a change from our last asset. Okay, so these textures have been imported, and the reason we need this opacity map is to tell the material which areas we want to be rendered and which areas we want to be transparent, so that it correctly shows the shape of the plant. Then we have the translucency map, which may look similar to the albedo map at first glance, but this is actually measuring the thickness or the translucency of each leaf, which is really useful when you're simulating how light shines through some thin leaves in real life. We can actually use this opaque master material that we just made as a starting point for our foliage master material. The reason we can't use the same master material is because we need to factor in transparency and masking, which isn't present in these opaque assets. So I'm going to duplicate this master material here. We're going to name it Foliage Master Material. And we're going to dive right in. So we already have the logic we set up before. So what do we have to add? If we look back at our inputs here, we have this opacity map and this translucency map, and we don't have a cavity map. So I'm actually going to remove the cavity logic here. And I'm just going to add a new duplicate of this albedo section. We're going to name it opacity. We're going to find opacity map. I have a lot here from this project, so I'm actually going to find the right one, which is this one. And we're going to name this opacity thickness. I wouldn't really touch this, but it is useful to thicken or thin the opacity depending on what effect you're going for. Sometimes some foliage can look too thin in the distance and thin out, or sometimes too thick up close. So it depends what you want, but it's useful to have this control. So you can see the opacity and the opacity mask pins here are actually grayed out. And the reason for this is we have to change our blend mode from opaque to masked, and this will allow us to input our opacity mask here. So then the last thing we've got to do is input our translucency map. To enable this, we got to go to our shading model, which is currently at default lit, and change it to two-sided foliage. I also tick this two-sided box usually. So I'm going to change this to SSS. And I'm actually going to navigate here to the viewport, select the node. You can browse by name, or you can select the texture you want in the editor and hit this arrow and it'll replace it here. All right, so we've got this node we've got to rename here. If you're wondering why I used the word SSS and not translucency when I'm naming these, it's because I'm inputting into the subsurface scattering input, which is what UE4 expects. So there may be a slight mismatch of terminology there. And then we'll hook that into our subsurface color. And it looks like we're good to go. So I'm going to add one rewrite node here just to clean that up a bit. And it looks like we're ready to go. So we're going to save this out. That's our foliage master material done. Very little different from the opaque. So doing this work once means that you can basically add any amount of new assets and they'll all use the same master materials, and you won't have to worry about setting new things up in the future. We haven't actually added in our dandelion mesh yet, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm just going to choose a single mesh for now. I'm going to drag it out into the world. Okay, so we're going to do the same thing as we did with the opaque master material. We're going to right click, create material instance. And we can bring this in here. So I'm actually going to assign this material, and you'll see that the shader is all messed up because we didn't actually change the defaults for the albedo normal roughness maps. And that's fine, it doesn't actually matter. As long as the master material logic is right, you can easily override this stuff in the shader. So to make this look good and correct, we're going to just replace the rock albedo with the dandelion albedo, the rock normal with the dandelion normal, and the roughness map as well. So now this should be looking pretty good. So like the rock asset, you can go ahead and tweak all of these parameters. I personally think that for a lot of the foliage assets, it's worth increasing the normal strength a bit. The default value, it's fine, but if you want to go a bit heavier, you can, to accentuate those details, and it can work nicely. So you can see the light updates very nicely when you move it around, and it looks pretty good. Okay, so this is our example finished. We've got our two master materials, which is the basis for this tutorial. Alright, so next we're going to go over setting up LODs, or levels of detail. To quickly demonstrate what a LOD is, I'm going to duplicate this mesh, and I'm going to replace it with the lower LOD that we brought in earlier. So as you can see, there was a little pop of detail there. It's kind of hard to notice sometimes with some meshes, but essentially what's happening is the triangle count is being lowered between each LOD step. So we actually have quite a drastic LOD step here from LOD 1 to 5. If you go over here, or even hover over the assets, you can see the triangle count here is 11,000 triangles, and here is only 1,000 triangles. So basically, the higher the triangle count, the more performance heavy the asset is going to be. So ideally, you'd have the high triangle count meshes up close, and then as you get further away, it would start to switch automatically to the lower LODs with lower triangle counts. So let's set that up right now. We're going to go ahead and double click into the static mesh. We're going to scroll down here to the LOD settings, and then we can go to this LOD import tab, import LOD level 1. You could definitely start from LOD 0 and work your way down through each LOD step if you wanted to. It's completely up to you and depends on the performance needs of your project. So for me, I'm just going to go for LOD 5 for now. We're going to hit open, and then if you look up here, you're going to see a new material slot has appeared, and if you start to zoom out, you'll see that it switches the mesh with that material. So if you remember before, we actually had a different normal map for the LOD 5. So we're going to just duplicate this material, and I'm going to say Rocco 1 LOD 5 map. So all we have to do for this LOD material is actually switch out the normal map. So you can see this is the LOD 5 normal map. We're going to pop it in here, and then if we go back to our rock asset, we're going to assign the LOD 5 map that we just created. So now when you zoom out, you can see it's switching. If you look up here, you see LOD 1, LOD 0, and you can see the updating triangle counts. The material is also updating, and this is working as intended. So now if you're an editor, you will notice a pop whenever you get further away from the mesh. And in this case, it's actually really subtle. But if you were to turn on your wireframe mode, you'll notice the wireframe changes. I'll even hide this to make it more apparent, but the wireframe changes as you get further away. So as you can see, the difference between the high LOD and the low LOD is quite subtle in this case. And what I did by creating a second material with a different LOD normal is actually fairly overkill. Typically, you would maybe import a medium LOD with the corresponding normal map, and then use the UE4 auto LOD tools to quickly create a new set of LODs for you based on your own parameters. So it's very fast and easy to set up, and is less cumbersome as you're only using one material. Alright, so now that we've LOD set up, we can go ahead and start thinking about lighting a basic scene. Before we do that, I just want to make sure that you're aware that now that we have the master material set up, we could download any of these rock assets and simply just make a new instance, swap out the textures, and apply the instance material to the mesh, and then we'd have each mesh set up the same way. So it's really powerful. There's amazing meshes on the site you should definitely check out. And now that we've got the base setup done behind the scenes, it's just about importing as many different ones you like and then arranging them. I also only really mentioned rock and 3D assets when I was creating the opaque master material, but they can absolutely be used for surfaces too, as they share the exact same map type inputs. So feel free to use the same master material for any surfaces that you download, and you can still have the same control and use the same parameters as you have with the rock assets. I've created this terrain in World Machine, which is a piece of software dedicated to creating detailed height maps, and it has the ability to bring in masks from erosion into UE4, which can then be plugged into materials. So it's a really useful piece of software. However, it's a completely different beast and not the focus for this tutorial at all. So I would highly recommend, if you are interested in creating a similar landscape to this, to going on YouTube and having a search for World Machine tutorials. This one in particular is really good. This basic shapes tutorial goes over a bunch of different terrain types like snow, desert, and shows a lot of common workflows. So if you find that interesting, you could probably then check out World Machine and give it a shot yourself. It's just not possible to cover such a detailed topic in this focused tutorial. So with that said, I'm creating this kind of a Scottish Highlands type of landscape, and I wanted to have those nice rolling hills and create those top cliff sections as well. So I've already gone ahead and created a landscape material. Again, this is something that's just specific to creating landscapes, and it's not possible to properly cover in this tutorial. However, it is just a simple 2 material blend, and it's blending between grass and the rock layer. So you can see that the mask imported from World Machine is defining which areas are rock and which areas are grass. Really, there's nothing crazy going on here. It's a very simple 2 material terrain setup. Here's a little look inside in case you're curious, but it looks a bit more complex than it actually is. I just have a few extra tweaks for artistic control, but I basically have the grass layer and the rock layer here, and they're just two material functions, so I can swap them out for other materials if I want to. So each one is using a set of textures I created with Megascans Studio, using a bunch of the basic grass surfaces. So I blended a few together and imported them. The same goes with the rock layer. It's more apparent here that it's just been a few different scans blended together, exported from Megascans Studio, and then imported to UE4. So I wouldn't worry too much here. There's plenty of good resources online about creating landscape materials, and I mainly wanted just to have something interesting to paint the rocks over. I've imported 4 rock assets from the Megascans site. You can see them here, and I've just assigned a material instance based off the master material that we created earlier. So you can see the asset IDs of each mesh as I hover over them. If you want to follow along with the same meshes, you can feel free to do so. Now to start creating the actual cliffs, I just moved these 4 rock meshes up above the landscape, and all I'm going to do now is start moving, scaling, rotating, and duplicating these rocks around, trying to create some convincing cliff silhouettes that feel like they belong inside the landscape. So this can be a fairly back and forth process, trial and error, until you get something that's looking pretty good. And don't worry too much about scaling unrealistically. It really is all about the final result and how the meshes are blending together. But it's a lot of fun to actually create kind of unique new cliffs out of a bunch of separate small rocks, and it's pretty rewarding when you get it kind of blending nicely with the landscape. So it's hard for someone to pick out where the landscape begins and where the cliff ends. So as you can see, it's fairly self-explanatory and just moving, scaling, rotating. No hidden tricks or anything like that. Just a matter of kind of picking out interesting looking shapes. I can see right here that the kind of main cliff in the center is very obviously flat and cut off because it's an open mesh, which means the back faces and the edges aren't going to be rendered. So it's important to kind of hide the seam with other meshes until you're getting this natural kind of result. So I'm starting at one side with these smaller rocks, and I'm layering them around to kind of give a nice border and try and hide the fact that there's a very obvious seam going up the middle main mesh. So I've kind of covered the side now, and I'm going to try and tackle the top, which will be important for kind of visual clarity to make sure that it doesn't not only looks interesting but also looks convincing and looks like it actually stands on its own. And after a little bit of playing around with it, I actually ended up getting rid of this kind of flat mesh because I just couldn't kind of hide that seam well enough to pass as a very interesting cliff. However, later on I do bring it back and it ended in the final scene. So just a matter of playing around and seeing what is kind of working and what isn't. I'm always taking screenshots, changing lighting scenarios, and just having a look back and forth at different versions. It's easy to kind of see what's looking good after you compare 3 or 4 different versions, and it's usually fairly simple to pick out one that works best. So I'm just kind of finding the spots that are weakest and moving new copies over, and when you rotate them around, you basically get a new side of the rock that isn't already visible, which to someone who's just looking at this whole cliff as a whole, they're not going to realize that it's the same rock duplicated. It's going to look like a different part of the cliff and nothing more. So don't worry about reusing rocks a lot. It's fairly easy to get a lot out of very few input rocks, which is really, really useful. So start with as few as you can and then build them up if you feel that you need more unique shapes. Alright, so after a bunch more scaling, rotating, and moving, I've come up with a layout that I'm fairly happy with. Next, I'm going to go ahead and walk through setting up lighting and post-processing from scratch. So I've deleted all lights in the scene and we're left with a black silhouette of the landscape and rocks, so nothing's lit right now. And I just dragged out a directional light to the scene, which is your main sunlight. I changed it to movable here because for this scene I'm staying with completely dynamic lights. However, if you're thinking about baked lighting or if you're optimizing, you want to make sure you're on stationary or static. But generally it's actually quite nice to work with movable lights while you're in this stage, which is you're blocking out the shapes and you're blocking out the different areas of the scene. So right there I just dropped in a skylight, which is your ambient light. So this is the light that is indirect. So coupled with your direct sunlight, you'll notice you get a nice realistic tone, especially in shadowed areas where the sun isn't hitting. You still get a little bit of fake bounce lighting, which is nice. It gives that feeling of realism to the scene. Next, I added an exponential height fog component, and this controls our global fog in the scene. And as you can see, I'm adjusting the start distance so that the distant parts of the landscape are affected by the fog, to give a little bit of contrast so that our foreground is a bit more in focus and we can kind of get a better sense of distance. It's important to note that you shouldn't go too crazy with this because it can look really unrealistic and kill the realism very quickly if you have the values fairly high. So I'd experiment with the density, the start distance, and the height fall off and find a value that works with you. So next up, I'm going to grab a post-process volume, which is the component needed for post-processing the scene. Switching it to unbound makes sure it affects the entire scene at once. And you can see there's loads of different effects. We've got rendering features, we've got tone mapping, and we've got all kinds of different cool goodies to play with here. So I'm going to start with the ambient occlusion, which is our shadowing. And it's important to increase this fade out distance parameter here to make sure it's affecting the world. In a large scene like this, the default fade out distance can be quite low, which means that you won't see an effect on distant objects. Then I'm playing with the power, which is essentially how strong the ambient occlusion is, and the radius, which is how far the distance is that another object can occlude another. So I'm setting it down to about 2 or 3, which is a fairly low value, but it's important not to go too heavy again with this because it can just look pretty fake if you have it at unrealistic values. I'm also resetting the auto exposure here, setting the min and max to 1, which means it doesn't change, because often if you're working on a scene and you change camera angle, the auto exposure is going to mess up and it's going to change the exposure greatly, and you'll start having to tweak values and realize you're kind of being messed over by the auto exposure because it's giving you different lighting values for different camera angles. Also, just playing with bloom right there, you can see with high bloom values you get this horrible kind of wet effect and it looks very fake. Same with the chromatic aberration. You can see that it looks very overdone if you put it past a small value. So I would recommend turning bloom off, keeping chromatic aberration at a very low value, if any. And the same goes for the grain and the vignette as well. These kind of effects are cool, but if you overdo them, it's very obvious and just kills any kind of realism you're going for. So just be careful with these values. They can make or break a scene for sure. Taking a little look at depth of field here, which essentially emulates how depth of field works on a camera. So you can have objects in focus and blur the background, which is really useful for close-up shots and getting a more cinematic look overall in your scene. So if I reduce the field of view, you can see the depth of field is more apparent. And then if I find a sweet spot and just tweak depth of field, you get a nice kind of contrast. This is all very much to taste and takes a bit of tweaking to find a cool result, but especially with the scans, you can get some really nice foreground shots if you just really zoom in on the details and blur out the background. I'm going to leave this off while we work on the scene, but just to quickly go over the color grading as well. It's a really nice set of tone mapping and color grading tools in the editor. And these are really good, just like photo editing or video editing software, to make final tweaks to the image when you're almost done. But for now, we're going to just work in the scene. And I just moved all my lighting components into a folder, which is useful to keep them grouped together and close together so you can quickly make changes, as they often depend on each other. So you can see changing the angle and the temperature, which is how hot or cold the light is, can make drastic changes to your scene. So it's worth doing this all the time while you're working on it to find the best angles. Sometimes you realize that a different angle works way better. So also under the skylight, you can see there's this tab here that says lower hemisphere solid color checkbox. If I turn that off, you'll notice that the indirect light actually brightens up quite a bit. And it's almost a way of getting fake indirect lighting to your scene. You can also do this by choosing a tint when the checkbox is checked. And you can actually make the indirect lighting a bit more matching to what's around it. So you can make it a dark tint of green to give slightly green shadows on top of the rocks. So the grass that was reflecting onto the rocks. Just for a bit more realism, it's just a kind of advanced tweak, but it can make a difference if sometimes your shadows look really dark and black and it doesn't really fit the tone of the scene. So this is a useful tip. Also change the intensity. I wouldn't be too scientific with any lighting values at all. I think it's always about what looks best in the end. So just play around, see what looks good. It's often finding the balance of the skylight and the directional light that's the hardest thing to do. But you can see there I found a kind of value in the middle that looks pretty decent. And then changing the directional light intensity, I increased it a little bit, and just playing with the angles, like I said, really important. You can get so much out of it, and never kind of commit to one angle unless you're very, very close to finishing the scene, because there's always room to change. And that's the power of the engine. You can keep changing and keep tweaking things, and it's all updating in real time, which is amazing. Now that we have the lighting set up, I wanted to show you the difference between the actual meshes, like the rocks we have here in this scene, and the rock assemblies which are on the site, like this one right here. Basically, assembly is a selection of small rocks, like little scattered rocks, in one mesh, which is really useful to help integrate the rocks into the scene. So in this case, I'm using this asset, and I'm going to start scattering these around the large rocks here to give a sense of depth and give a sense of kind of fall off from these rocks, because right now they look very obvious that they're just big meshes that have been just set into the ground. So to try and break them in and blend them in is really important. I opened up the Foliage painter tool, which, although it says Foliage, is also really useful for painting smaller meshes around as well, as hand placing a lot of scatter meshes is going to take a long time. So I'm using this scatter set, as I said before, and I isolated them all to single meshes, and bringing them into the Foliage painter tool, I can see here that with them selected, I can have control over the density, the scale, the rotation, and a bunch of other stuff. So I'm lowering the density and I'm increasing the scale. So minimum 5, maximum 12 to give a bit of variation. But right away, as I paint them out, you can see there's that kind of ugly kind of border around them from the actual base of the mesh. And this does not look good, doesn't look natural. But luckily, UE4 has a really nice Z offset parameter here, which can fix this problem really fast. So basically you're saying I want to spawn my meshes minimum 8 units under the ground, which will hide that kind of base. And now if I paint them out again, you can see we've got a perfect result. It looks like the rocks are actually coming out and resting on the ground in a much more natural way. So that's awesome. I'm going to start painting all around the manually placed rocks now and trying to make them feel like they're integrated a bit more. So this is the fun part. I've also, just to make a note, I've deselected static meshes in the filters tab over on the paint toolbar, so it won't paint on top of the existing meshes. It'll only paint on the landscape right now, which is really useful because we want to have these around the rocks and not on top of the rocks too. You can often get some weird angles and you'd see the borders coming out again in that case. So I'm just playing with densities and scales and just trying to paint around and seeing what looks good. Often it's a good idea to go overkill and then start erasing when it seems a bit too much, but so far it seems like it's going pretty well. It just really adds that nice natural line of where you can't notice what's the landscape and what's the actual asset anymore. It's really good for blending. I think right here I realized this patch is just too much, so I undo that and focus on a different area. So like I said, making nice changes to the scale so you've got some variance in that is really good, and just erasing areas where the fall off seems unrealistic. You don't want anything to feel too consistent or too kind of circular. Like the tool is a perfect circle, so if you start noticing perfect patterns, it's a good idea to then start erasing them away and making it feel a bit more natural. So at this point I've covered most of the rocks and I think it looks a lot better. I think everything is integrated much more naturally, and we get this nice fall off around the rocks, which is exactly what we were going for. So on this rock here I just felt it was a bit strange, so I increased the scale and blended in some bigger rocks there as well. Now that we have our cliff sections feeling pretty natural, I thought it's best to move on to foliage. So I imported this grass asset the same way as we did with the dandelion earlier on. And like the cliff assets, I'm just playing with the density and the scaling in the scatter tool and seeing what kind of results I'm going to get. So right here I just think it's way too dense, so I'm decreasing the density until it feels like it's at a reasonable amount. We want to be conscious of performance here, and the higher densities are obviously going to be much more performance heavy than low densities. So I found a density that feels to me like it's decent. I'm still getting good coverage, but I'm not kind of sacrificing the frame rate. And like the rocks, it's a good idea just to paint kind of naturally, avoid too many obvious patterns, and moving the light angle around like this can really help expose any kind of repeating patterns like that very easily. So I'm also playing with lighting because I felt the grass was shading a bit strangely, and with these tweaks it feels like it's a bit more natural. So you'll also notice that through asset types you might want to change lighting or the material properties to suit the scene a bit better. So I've warmed up the scene and I've changed the angle, and I'm just finding the kind of best spot, the sweet spot. And this can obviously keep changing throughout the scene, but like I said, keep experimenting and find what works best. So I'm happy with this, and I'm going to continue painting, trying to avoid obvious patches. I'll be going over again and erasing, and when you start bringing in more and more different foliage assets, the repetition or any kind of obvious procedural patterns will start being phased out. If you start placing other assets in different random ways, it'll really start to break things up, and it starts to get really fun. So this is like the base grass layer of the scene, and then we're going to further push it out with other assets. Alright, so I've brought in a bunch of new assets from the Megascans site, some clovers, tall grass, dead leaves, and a bunch of other foliage assets. So starting with the clovers, bringing them into the Foliage Painter tool and adjusting density, scale as usual. And this is going to really start helping to break up the kind of holes and the repetition with the grass. So as I start painting these out, you can see the holes are getting filled in, and your eye is picking up all this nice new detail. It's really important to note that you shouldn't go too crazy with the detail. If you were to paint this as dense as the grass is, your eye starts to just lose track of what's going on, and it becomes just too busy and too difficult to look at. So it's a good idea to make sure that you have kind of patches, especially for these kind of very detailed clovers. And with the patches, at least it brings your eye to certain areas and kind of splits up the terrain a bit, which is really good. So I'm just kind of going over and looking and seeing which areas could use a bit more variation, and I'm going to do this with every other foliage asset that I'm using in this scene until basically every layer I add, it's going to expose new areas that feel like they need to have more variation. And as I keep adding more assets, those areas get fixed and they're less and less problem areas until we have a pretty much final looking scene. Next up, I'm going to grab this dandelion asset. I'm going to throw it into the foliage tool as usual. And this is a really detailed asset, so I'm making sure that when I'm painting it out, the scale is going to be correct and it's going to feel like it belongs in the world. Don't always use the same scale for all different assets. Sometimes things actually look better scaled up or down. Even if it's not 100% real world realistic, it can still work in the scene. So I'm just finding a scale that looks pretty much right here. I'm just painting it around, making sure it's not too obvious or too out of place, but that it's still adding something meaningful. Like, it's often you can paint something and it actually just disappears because it's too small or too insignificant. So in that case, you wouldn't even bother having it there in the first place. So you can see now between the terrain material and the assets, we're getting a very nice kind of variation in terms of the color palette that's coming out. We're getting kind of dark yellowy green up to the pure vibrant green as well. So we're getting a lot out of it, which is pretty cool. But there's still a lot of patches we can see that are empty looking and don't quite work. So we're going to add more different foliage assets to help fill those out. Moving on, we're going to grab some tall grass assets and bring them into the Foliage Painter. Notice I'm using LOD 2 here, and this is because I'm just being conscious of using optimized assets to make sure that since we're painting these really dense grass assets, we don't want to be using the super detailed higher poly assets. We want to be using assets that look good enough for what we want. And at this range and this distance, these look really good. And there's no real reason to use the expensive LOD 0 or LOD 1 meshes. So I think the tall grass is actually adding a nice amount of new height variation to the scene, nicely kind of hiding some of the rocks and just adding a bit more depth. But the scene is at the point now where I feel it's time to evaluate the lighting again and see how it's hitting, because I feel it's quite dense and a bit busy to the eye. So I'm just going to work on changing the directional light intensity, the skylight intensity, dropping down the indirect light a bit, and then moving around the light angles to see how the different angles are going to affect the scene overall. And it's a good idea to play with different kind of light scenarios. So right here I'm going for a kind of sunset scene, and sometimes you might actually realize that different scenarios make the scene look way better, and you'll stick with those for the final version. So always worth playing around. But in my case, I'm gonna tone it back to what I had before, and it's just constant evaluation of what is working and what isn't. I highly recommend taking screenshots using F9 and going into full screen mode like this. Really useful to get a better sense of what's working. So if you're constantly taking screenshots in full screen mode and looking back through the previous screenshots, I guarantee at one point you're going to go too far and you'll realize that a previous version actually worked better, because it's really hard to know what's working with your scene and what isn't. So I highly recommend jumping into full screen mode, having a little fly around, taking a bunch of screenshots, and it'll really help, especially when you're getting near the final stages of your scene. Next, I brought in a few custom tree assets, which I made using Megascans atlases and a 3ds Max plugin called GrowFX, which is a really powerful and cool plugin. I'd highly recommend it if you're building your own custom foliage, because you can basically leverage the power of procedural trunks and stems with the nice scanned data from the leaves and fronds. So it's really cool. I'd highly recommend it if you're building custom stuff. Right now I'm starting to clear out some space from under the trees. I'm going to start putting some dead, dried out grass and twigs under there, because we want to have a nice variation from the healthy, dense grass that's in the direct sunlight, and then have some kind of more dead and fitting foliage underneath the shaded areas under the trees. So you can see when I'm painting this out, this nice dense layer, you get this really nice fall off from the healthy area into the dense area, and it ends up looking really natural. So finally, to add that little extra bit of depth, I'm going to grab some twigs from the site and scatter them around also. I've picked this asset out, it's pretty nice. And all I've done is downloaded it and separated out each individual twig as a separate mesh, so that we can easily scatter with the foliage painter. Right away, as I start painting, you'll see how fast it is to get a really nice convincing result. Just that really natural blend between the grass and the twigs kind of poking out. It really sells that effect of the undergrowth. So I'm pretty happy with how this scene is looking right now. I've tackled all the major areas that I wanted to tackle, and I'm just going to go into full screen and have a look around and see if there's any final things I want to tweak. Just make sure the scales are right and everything is feeling good. So I'm pretty happy. I'm just going to go over quickly enabling that checkbox to paint on static meshes, which would, in this case, allow you to paint twigs on top of the rocks. If you wanted to add a little more depth, instead of placing each rock down and having no kind of objects or debris scattered on top of the rocks, you can do that here. So it can be a bit hard to find a really natural looking result, but it can be really powerful, just scattering little twigs and pebbles on top of the rocks, just to give a little bit extra kind of weight to them, make them feel like they blend in a bit more. I think this one was a bit overkill, so I toned it back, but scattering the twigs around and near objects really gives them that kind of transition zone that they need sometimes. So just to show a little trick to help blend your rock assets into the landscape a bit better, I'm just going to isolate only the rocks by hiding all other foliage layers. And you may notice if you zoom closely into the seam between your rock and your landscape where they intersect, you might notice that it looks very digital and harsh, and it doesn't look very natural. So it was a quick little trick that was shown actually by Ryan Brooks from Epic, I believe, which helps you blend much more smoothly between the two. So you create a dither temporal AA node and multiply it by a scalar parameter, and input that to the pixel depth offset input in the master material for the rocks. So I've made a parameter name dither blend amount, and I'm going to set the default value to something small. If you set it beyond 20, you're going to start noticing that the entire rock starts to blend a little bit. So just be careful with the amount here. But if you play with it, you can really soften that transition between the rock and the landscape. So I'm going to just show you how it works right here. You can see when I'm really bumping up the value, you're losing some of the actual hardness of the rock, but you're getting a much more seamless blend between the landscape and the actual rock asset. So you see there the really harsh line, and then increasing the dither amount really gets rid of that. So like I said, it's more of a trick than a standard technique, but it does help in areas where you're going to be up close and you want to kind of get rid of that unnatural looking seam. Alright, so that wraps it up. Hopefully you learned something new about creating environments, and feel free to send on any scenes you create yourselves to the Quixel Tools group on Facebook. You can find a lot of cool things there, and as well remember that you can apply these same techniques to the scene on a larger scale, to painting and moving around assets there. So with that, I'm going to sign out, and thanks for watching. Talk to you later.